The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky with soft shades of pink and gold. A gentle breeze passed through the small town, carrying the faint smell of wet grass and morning air. Birds sat on the electric wires singing their usual songs. It was a quiet, peaceful morning, the kind of morning when life felt simple and good. Inside a modest little house at the corner of the street, a man stepped out of his small bedroom, stretching his arms after a good night's sleep. His house wasn't big, but to him it was everything. He had built parts of it with his own hands years ago. Every wall, every nail, and every corner carried a memory. The living room was neat, with an old but comfortable sofa placed against the wall. A faded family picture hung above it. In the kitchen, the kettle was already on the stove, ready for his morning tea. He walked slowly through the hallway, touching the wooden doorframe as he passed, like he did every day. He liked small habits. They gave him a sense of rhythm, of life moving at its own pace. The morning light entered through the window, making the house look warm and calm. He loved this part of the day. He opened the front door and stepped outside, breathing in deeply. The air felt fresh and the world seemed quiet. A neighbor across the street waved at him while walking their dog. He lifted his hand in return, giving a warm smile. For a moment, he simply stood on the steps, feeling grateful for what he had. Back inside, the water began to boil. He poured it into his cup, added some tea leaves, and stirred it slowly. The sound of the spoon tapping against the cup felt familiar. It was a simple life, but it was his life. He worked hard every day, came home tired, and found peace here. The house wasn't perfect, but it held everything that mattered to him. Memories, laughter, quiet moments, and dreams he once dared to chase. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. He sat down at the small table, sipping his tea, looking out the window at the empty street. Sometimes he thought about the past, how far he had come, how hard he had worked. It wasn't always easy. There were days he thought he would lose it all. But somehow life had always given him another chance, and this house standing strong was a reminder of that. In the back of the house, a soft ticking sound started. At first, it was too faint to notice. The man was lost in his thoughts, thinking about his plans for the day. He had to go to work later, but for now, everything felt steady. He stood up to wash his cup and glanced at the small shelf near the sink. On it sat an old framed photo, edges worn with time. In the picture, he was younger, standing in front of this same house. His smile back then was wide, full of hope. Looking at it always made him smile again. Outside, the sky grew brighter. Sunlight began to warm the windows. He walked through the house again, straightening things, picking up a book from the coffee table, fixing the cushion on the sofa. These small tasks were part of his morning ritual. He liked having things in their place. But in the corner of the kitchen, where the old wooden wall met the electrical outlet, something tiny was happening. A weak spark flashed for a brief second. It was almost silent. No one saw it. Then it happened again, only a little stronger this time. The wires were old, worn out from years of use. The spark touched a dry piece of curtain that hung close by. It caught almost silently, a tiny orange glow, no bigger than a fingertip. The man walked into the bathroom to wash his face, humming a quiet tune to himself. He turned on the tap, letting the cool water run through his hands. He had no idea that in the next few minutes, everything he had built, everything he loved, was about to change. In the kitchen, the small flame grew. It crawled upward, slow at first, like it was learning how to breathe. Then the breeze from the half-open window helped it spread faster. The fabric darkened. Smoke started to rise, curling up toward the ceiling. Within seconds, the gentle kitchen that had always felt warm began to fill with the smell of burning cloth. The man turned off the tap and reached for a towel, still unaware of the danger building behind him. He wiped his face, looked into the mirror, and smiled faintly. Then as he stepped out of the bathroom, something caught his attention. A faint crackling sound. At first, he thought it was nothing. Maybe something outside. But then he smelled it. A sharp, strange smell like burnt paper. His heart gave a small, uneasy beat. He walked toward the kitchen slowly. When he reached the doorway, his eyes widened. The curtain by the wall was already half covered in flames. Smoke was spreading fast. The air was thick and hot. For a second, his mind froze. It didn't feel real. Just minutes ago, everything was quiet and peaceful. Now the sound of fire filled the house. He rushed forward, grabbed a towel, and tried to beat down the flames, but the fire was already too strong. It had moved to the cabinet. A small explosion from the old socket sent sparks flying. He stumbled back, coughing as the smoke grew heavier. Panic set in. He turned to grab a bucket of water, but before he could move, the fire jumped higher, licking the ceiling. He could hear the crackle of wood, the sound of something falling in the next room. Heat pressed against his face like a wall. His eyes burned from the smoke. He ran to the front door, threw it open, and shouted for help. Neighbors who had been quietly going about their morning turned their heads immediately. A few people came running. Someone shouted for the fire department. The man rushed back toward the house's entrance, still hoping he could save something. Anything. But the flames had already spread to the living room. The heat was unbearable now. The family picture above the sofa had started to curl and blacken from the smoke. The cushions were burning. A table leg cracked and fell. He tried to step inside again, but the smoke pushed him back like a wave. His chest ached as he coughed hard, tears streaming down his face, not just from the smoke but from the helplessness setting in. The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. Someone pulled him away from the door as flames burst through the front window, sending glass flying onto the porch. The once calm house was now a roaring monster. Flames danced up the walls. The roof groaned as if the house itself was crying. He stood barefoot on the cold ground, watching the fire devour everything. The breeze that felt so fresh just minutes ago now carried the bitter smell of burning wood and smoke. Neighbors gathered around him, some holding their hands over their mouths in shock. Someone placed a blanket around his shoulders, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the house. He whispered to himself, not even realizing it. This was his home, his safe place. The walls had heard his laughter. The floors had carried his footsteps every single day. The windows had watched him grow older. Now it was all disappearing right in front of him in a matter of minutes. The fire trucks arrived and firefighters rushed toward the house, pulling heavy hoses. Water sprayed over the flames, hissing as it touched the burning wood. Smoke rose higher, mixing with the morning sky. Commands were shouted, boots stomped, and hoses roared. But all he could hear was a single thought in his mind. This can't be real. One of the firefighters gently asked him if anyone else was inside. He shook his head slowly, too stunned to speak. Another neighbor stood beside him, whispering words meant to comfort, but they felt far away like echoes from a different world. The man's eyes followed the bright orange glow as it slowly faded to a dark gray cloud of smoke. The house, the place that had taken him years to build, was gone in seconds. Not a slow loss, not something he could prepare for. Just flames, smoke, and silence after the chaos. He felt a strange emptiness growing in his chest, spreading through his entire body. It was as if the fire had burned a hole in his heart too. Even after the last flame was out, he didn't move. He just stood there, wrapped in a blanket, his hands still trembling. The firefighters walked through what was left, checking the walls, stepping carefully over blackened wood. The neighbors slowly began to leave, but some stayed, watching him with quiet sympathy. The breeze grew colder as the morning sun climbed higher. The man finally sat down on the steps, his steps, the ones he used to walk on every single morning, greeting a new day. Now they were covered in ash. His cup of tea still sat on the table inside the kitchen, but the kitchen itself was gone. His books, his furniture, his old photograph, all of it had disappeared in the fire. His eyes watered again, but he didn't cry loudly. The tears fell quietly like the ash falling from the broken roof. He didn't know what tomorrow would look like. He didn't even know where he would sleep tonight. All he knew was that in one ordinary morning, without any warning, everything he had worked for was taken away in seconds. Yet somewhere deep inside, beneath the shock and the pain, a small part of him still breathed. It was weak, quiet, but it was there. He didn't know it yet, but this wasn't the end of his story. Something unexpected, something priceless was still waiting to be found in the ashes. For now, though, he just sat in silence, staring at the blackened frame of the house he once called home. The world kept moving around him, but his time had stopped. The sound of the fire trucks faded away. The last drops of water fell from the burned ceiling, and the birds had gone quiet. It was just him and the ruins, and even though he felt like he had lost everything, something told him deep down, this was not where his life ended. This was where it would begin again. The sun had climbed higher in the sky now, but the warmth couldn't reach him. He stood on the edge of the street, staring at the blackened skeleton of his house. Smoke still curled from the ruins, twisting upward like the last cries of something that had once been alive. He tried to remember what it had looked like just yesterday. The small living room with its soft sofa, The kitchen where the kettle hissed every morning, the little bedroom that smelled faintly of his favorite soap. All of it was gone. Neighbors whispered among themselves, glancing at him with worried eyes. Some offered blankets, others brought bottles of water. One older man patted his shoulder gently, saying something about insurance or help from the fire department, but the words barely reached him. He felt as though he were trapped in a dream he desperately wanted to wake up from. Every detail came back to him in flashes. He remembered leaving the kitchen just minutes before the fire had started, washing his face, humming softly. He remembered the faint smell, the tiny crackle, the sudden roar of flames. It all felt impossibly fast. It was almost unfair how quickly everything could disappear. A volunteer handed him a cup of water, but he barely touched it. His hands were still trembling from the heat and fear, and more from the sudden emptiness in his chest. He tried to think about the future, about what he could do next, but his mind kept returning to the past. Memories of laughter with friends, quiet evenings alone with a book, mornings spent sipping tea while watching the sunrise. They all belonged to a life that no longer existed. He wandered closer to the remains of the house. The ground was covered with ash, black and gray, soft under his bare feet. He stepped carefully over charred wood, trying not to fall. Every step reminded him that nothing in that space was familiar anymore. He reached for what used to be the living room sofa, and his hand brushed against a burnt frame. Inside it had once been a photo of his family, smiling on a holiday trip long ago. Now it was nothing more than a blackened slab. Tears pricked at his eyes. He crouched down and ran his fingers through the ashes, almost expecting to pull something solid from the pile. But there was nothing. Everything was gone: his clothes, his favorite mug, the little notes he had tucked inside books, the small plant that had grown stubbornly in the corner. Everything. He could hear the sound of sirens fading in the distance. The firefighters were leaving. The street was growing quiet again, but for him, silence was worse than noise. He felt like he was trapped in it, like it had weight pressing down on his chest. He sank onto the curb, wrapped his arms around his knees, and let the grief come. It was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, heavy, and unrelenting. Memories mixed with smoke and ash in his mind. He remembered the birthday he had celebrated alone, smiling through loneliness because he wanted to keep hope alive. He remembered the first night he had moved into this house, how proud he had felt of the small things he had built with his own hands. And now all of that pride, all of that hope, seemed to have been swallowed in flames. Neighbors approached carefully, unsure if words could reach him. One woman handed him a small blanket, trying to offer warmth, not realizing that warmth could not fix the emptiness in his chest. He took it silently, draping it over his shoulders, but it felt meaningless against the enormity of what he had lost. A friend from down the street came up quietly. He didn't try to speak. He just sat next to him, letting the man absorb the silence of the ashes. Sometimes words weren't needed. Sometimes the presence of another human being was the only thing that could remind someone they were still alive. Hours passed. The sky grew brighter and the world moved on outside the circle of devastation. Mail carriers drove past. People went about their errands. Children laughed as they played down the street. Life continued, indifferent to the loss that had just occurred. He noticed it and felt both anger and sorrow. How could the world move on when his entire life had been reduced to ash in a few minutes? He thought about where he would go now. The little bed in the corner, the warm blankets, the quiet bedroom, it was all gone. He would have to find somewhere to stay, somewhere to rest, somewhere to feel a sense of safety again. But he didn't know how to start. Everything felt like it had collapsed, not just the house, but the sense of control he had over his life. And yet, even in this deep grief, something faint stirred inside him. He didn't see it yet. It was tiny, like the first flicker of morning light before the sun fully rises. It was the part of him that remembered he had survived the fire. That meant there was still a chance to rebuild. That meant all of this pain, as unbearable as it was not the end. He took a deep breath, coughing from the smoke still clinging to the air. He felt the rough texture of ash on his palms. It stuck to his skin and under his nails. He looked down at it and, strangely, saw something almost familiar in it. The ashes were evidence that something had existed. They were proof that life had been here, and perhaps in some way they were proof that life could exist again. He didn't move for a long time, just sitting there, staring at the ruins of his house. His mind wandered to the little things he had once taken for granted. The smell of tea in the morning, the sound of his own footsteps in the hallway, the comfort of sleeping under his blankets. All gone. Yet somewhere in that emptiness he knew he still carried those memories inside him. They were untouchable, safe from the fire. Slowly he stood up, brushing ash from his clothes. His body ached and his mind was heavy, but he took one small step forward, one foot in front of the other. He walked to the edge of the street where a volunteer had set up a small relief station, offering blankets, water, and food. He accepted a bottle of water, swallowing slowly, tasting the faint sweetness. It was something small, but it reminded him he was still alive, still part of the world outside the ashes. He looked back at the ruins one more time. The house was gone. Nothing remained but smoke, charred wood, and memories. He felt a sudden sharp pang of grief, real, painful, and deep. But it was accompanied by another feeling, smaller, quieter, and harder to recognize. There was still a chance. There was still a future waiting for him. He didn't know what that future would look like. He didn't know where he would sleep tonight, how he would start over, or how long it would take to feel safe again. But as he took another deep breath, he made a silent promise to himself. He would survive this. He would face the coming days no matter how hard. And somehow he would find a way to move forward step by step, just as he had in the past when life had tested him before. The rest of the street slowly returned to normal. People went back to their morning routines, carrying on as though nothing had happened. But for him, everything had changed. His home was gone. His belongings were gone. The life he had built, however small, was gone. And yet within that loss, a quiet determination began to grow. It was fragile. It was uncertain. But it was there. And as he sat down on the curb once again, feeling the warmth of the sun on his back despite the devastation around him, he realized that grief, as heavy and painful as it was, also had a strange way of making a person see clearly. He could not bring back what he had lost, but he could choose what to do with what remained: himself, his memories, and the faint, stubborn spark of hope that still burned inside him. Hours later, as the first firefighters left and the street began to empty, he remained. He wandered carefully through the ashes again, touching what remained, remembering what had been. And somewhere deep inside, a thought started to form, almost like a whisper, maybe, just maybe. Not everything was lost, and for the first time since the fire, he allowed himself to hope. The morning after the fire, he woke up in a small borrowed room. It wasn't his home, and it didn't feel like it, but it was safe, and that was enough for now. The events of the previous day were still heavy on his mind. Every sound, every shadow seemed to pull him back to the fire. The roaring flames, the smoke, the smell of burned wood that lingered in his nose. He felt a hollow weight in his chest, as though the house hadn't just burned. It had taken a piece of him with it. After a few quiet moments of staring out the window at the street below, he knew he couldn't stay away forever. He needed to go back. Not to rebuild, not yet, but to see, to touch, to face what had happened. He had to step through the ashes of his life, even if it hurt, even if the grief tried to stop him. The street looked almost peaceful in the morning light. Neighbors walked past, their footsteps soft on the pavement. A few people stopped to nod at him quietly, offering a small smile of support. He returned their gestures with a faint smile of his own, though inside he felt numb. When he reached the remains of his house, he paused. The blackened frame still stood, but it was fragile, delicate, almost unreal. Smoke rose lazily from the burned roof and scattered in the wind. The smell of charred wood and melted plastic filled the air. He stepped closer slowly, feeling the heat that still clung to the ruins. Every step he took was careful. The ground was uneven, covered in ash, broken wood, and fragments of what had once been his life. Every piece seemed to carry a story, a memory that now existed only in his mind. He ran his fingers over the ashes, feeling the texture, soft, fine, almost like sand. It left streaks of gray on his hands, sticking stubbornly under his nails. He began moving through the remains of the house methodically. The kitchen was almost entirely gone. The cabinets were blackened, the floor sagged, and what little hadn't burned completely was warped and unrecognizable. He paused at the doorway where he had first seen the flames. It had all started here. The corner of the wall still bore the faint marks of a small spark that had grown into a wall of fire. He pressed his palm against the cold, rough wood, remembering the tiny moment before disaster. He moved to the living room. The sofa was reduced to a charred outline, the cushions nothing but ash. A blackened frame that had once held a photograph of him as a child leaned against the wall, half melted, half crumbled. He picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of its loss. It was gone. Everything inside it was gone. But holding it, he could almost remember the faces and the laughter. Memory became a small treasure, fragile but alive. Step by step, he moved through the ruins. Each room offered the same story: destruction, loss, absence. He could not believe how fast life could change. One morning, everything was normal. One morning, a lifetime of work, memories, and comfort had been reduced to ash. Then, as he reached what had been his bedroom, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But as he moved closer, he realized there was something partially buried beneath a pile of ash and debris. It was small, dark, and oddly intact amidst the destruction. His heart thumped in a strange way, not from fear, but from curiosity, hope, and disbelief all at once. He knelt down, brushing away the layers of ash carefully, almost afraid that the item would crumble like everything else. His fingers trembled as he cleared more and more of the soot. Slowly, he saw its shape. It was familiar, not like the objects he had lost to the fire, fragile or delicate, but something small, simple and personal. He lifted it gently, holding it against his chest. It was a piece of his past he had thought gone forever, a childhood keepsake he had treasured in secret, hidden in a drawer long ago. Somehow, almost miraculously, it had survived the fire. He sat back on the floor, cradling it carefully. The weight of the item was nothing compared to the weight of what it represented. Memories flooded in, uncontrollable, warm, and vivid. He remembered the first time he had held it as a child, the way it had made him feel safe, loved, and seen. It was as if a part of his life had been protected, preserved against all odds. For the first time since the fire, a faint smile appeared on his face. Tears welled in his eyes, but they were different from the ones he had cried yesterday. These tears were not only grief, they were gratitude, relief, and wonder. Something precious had survived the destruction. Something irreplaceable had been spared. He looked around at the ruins again. The house was still gone. The furniture, the photographs, the books, and the little objects that had filled his life were still lost. But now in his hands he held proof that not everything could be taken away. The fire had destroyed what could be replaced, but it had not touched what was most meaningful in his heart. Slowly he rose to his feet, clutching the keepsake tightly. The morning sun shone brighter, and for a moment he felt the warmth not just on his skin but in his chest. He knew he had to move forward, even if the path was unclear. The house was gone, but this small piece of his past reminded him that life could continue. That hope could survive even the worst destruction. He spent hours going through the ashes, moving carefully, but he didn't find anything else like it. Everything else was burned, melted, or broken beyond recognition. Yet he didn't mind. This single discovery was enough to remind him that not all was lost. The fire had taken his home, his belongings, and his comfort, but it had not taken his memories, his resilience, or the part of him that still hoped for the future. Neighbors passed by quietly, giving him space, and some watched with gentle curiosity. They saw him crouched among the rubble, tears in his eyes, holding something small, almost invisible amidst the chaos. They didn't interrupt. They didn't need to. In silence, they understood that this moment mattered more than words could express. By the time the sun reached its peak, he finally stepped back from the ruins. His hands were black with ash and his clothes were marked by soot. Yet he felt lighter than he had in days. He had seen the fire, endured its destruction, and faced the emptiness it left behind. And now he had found a reason to move forward, a small but powerful reminder that life, even after loss, could hold treasures that fire could not destroy. He stood for a long while, looking at the remains of his house one last time that morning. Then carefully he wrapped the keepsake in a cloth and placed it in his pocket. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know where he would sleep tonight, how he would rebuild, or what challenges the future would bring. But he knew that he had found something priceless in the ashes, something no fire could ever take away. And in that realization, the first small step toward recovery began. The keepsake rested in his hands, small and unassuming, yet heavy with meaning. At first he couldn't speak. He just held it and let the warmth of memories wash over him. The fire had taken so much, his home, his belongings, the life he had built, but somehow this tiny piece had survived. It was like a lifeline thrown into the chaos, a reminder that some things, the things that truly mattered, could not be destroyed. He remembered exactly when he had first received it years ago, tucked away in a drawer he seldom opened. It had been a gift, simple and small, yet it carried love and care that had stayed with him through every stage of his life. He traced its edges with his fingers, feeling every scratch, every curve, every imperfection. Those imperfections told a story of time passing, of life lived. They reminded him of moments he had laughed, cried, and grown. Sitting on the curb, he let himself remember everything. He thought about quiet evenings spent alone, reading a book while the wind rattled the windows. He remembered mornings like this one, where the sun painted the room gold and he felt content if only for a little while. He remembered birthdays and holidays, small celebrations with neighbors and friends, laughter spilling over, and moments of silence that had felt like peace. All of it, he realized, lived in his memory, and now in his hands was a tangible piece of that life. Tears filled his eyes, not the kind of tears that only come from loss, but tears of gratitude, awe, and relief. The fire had been cruel, destroying, so much in a matter of seconds, but this small object reminded him that life had a way of giving back. Even in the darkest moments, he squeezed it gently, careful not to drop it. It felt like holding hope itself. Neighbors passed by, some giving him a small nod, some whispering softly to each other, noticing the emotion in his face. No one interrupted him. They could feel that he was in a private world of memory and reflection, and they respected it. Slowly, he allowed himself to speak aloud, even if no one was listening. He murmured stories he remembered, words he hadn't said in years. He laughed softly at the thought of small mistakes, mistakes that now seemed trivial, but had once caused so much worry. He smiled through tears at memories of kindness, generosity, and quiet love. The keepsake had survived, and in doing so, it reminded him of everything that had shaped him. It was not wealth or possessions that defined his life, he realized. It was the love he had given and received, the lessons he had learned, and the moments that had made him who he was. That was priceless. That could not be burned or broken. For hours, he sat there, holding it, remembering everything that mattered. Slowly, a sense of calm began to settle over him. The panic, the shock, the hollow emptiness. They were still there, but they were quieter now. The fire had taken the walls and the roof, but it could not take his spirit. It could not erase what he had carried inside all along. He looked up at the ruins of his house, seeing them differently than he had yesterday. The charred beams and blackened walls were no longer just a symbol of loss. They were also proof of survival. They showed that he had endured something unimaginable and had emerged still standing, still able to feel, still able to hope. Holding the keepsake close to his heart, he realized something important. This was more than just a memory or a memento. It was a lesson. Life could change in a single moment. Everything could be gone, and yet, some things, some of the most important things, would remain. Love, memories, hope, resilience. These were the things worth holding on to, the things that defined life itself. He breathed deeply, letting the cool morning air fill his lungs. The smoke still lingered faintly, but it no longer felt suffocating. Instead, it was a reminder of the fire he had survived. The ruins would need to be cleared, the house would need to be rebuilt, and life would need to be reconstructed piece by piece. But he knew now that he could face it, because he had already found something no fire could ever take away. A quiet determination began to form inside him, stronger than fear, stronger than grief. He would rebuild his life, not just his house. He would start small, piece by piece, remembering what truly mattered. And as long as he carried the keepsake with him, he knew he could face anything. It was proof that life could endure even when everything seemed lost. He stood up, brushing ash from his clothes. The keepsake remained safely in his pocket, a secret treasure, a lifeline. He walked slowly down the street, past neighbors offering quiet support, past children playing, past the ordinary life that went on despite tragedy. He felt something shift inside him, a sense that he could move forward. Not quickly, not easily, but steadily, step by step. For the first time since the fire, he allowed himself to imagine the future. Not the house, not the possessions, but the life he could rebuild. He pictured mornings like this again, simple and peaceful. He pictured evenings filled with laughter and quiet reflection. He pictured a life where he had learned from loss but not been defined by it. The keepsake rested against his chest through it all, a reminder of what he had survived, of what could not be taken. It was small yet immense in meaning, and in that moment he understood the truth. Sometimes losing everything makes you realize the value of what you already carry inside. Sometimes the ashes left behind are not the end. They are the beginning of something far more important. He took one last look at the ruins of the house before turning away. The fire had ended one chapter, but he was ready to begin the next. The keepsake in his hand was not just a memory, it was a symbol of life, love, and resilience, and with it he stepped forward, carrying hope where the fire had left only ashes. Days passed, and the blackened remains of the house became part of the neighborhood's quiet landscape. People walked past, some pausing to glance at the charred ruins, others moving on with their lives. The man, however, didn't turn away anymore. He faced the ruins each morning, studying what remained, remembering what had been lost, and quietly planning what could come next. The keepsake he had found in the ashes never left his pocket. It was small, almost fragile, but to him it was the most valuable thing in the world. Whenever despair threatened to creep in, he would touch it, feel its weight, and remember that life could endure. It reminded him that no matter how much the world took away, some things, love, hope, and memories, could never be destroyed. Friends and neighbors began to visit more frequently. Some brought food, some brought blankets, and others offered tools and materials for rebuilding. Their support was quiet and steady, never pushing, just being there. They didn't try to replace what had been lost because they knew it couldn't be replaced. Instead, they helped him take the first steps toward something new. He started small, first clearing the debris, separating what could be salvaged, and making a safe space to stand. Every piece of charred wood he removed felt like a small victory, a way to reclaim some control over the chaos. The work was hard and exhausting, but with each movement he felt a tiny spark of strength returning. He realized that rebuilding wasn't just about walls and roofs, it was about rebuilding himself. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when the weight of loss pressed down, when he could barely lift a shovel or see the point in continuing, but every time despair threatened, he would hold the keepsake close and remember what it represented. It was a reminder that life could endure the worst, that hope could survive even the fiercest fire. As the weeks went by, small signs of progress began to appear. A frame of a new house took shape, rough and simple but solid. Neighbors brought supplies, helped with lifting and measuring, and offered advice learned from their own experiences. It wasn't fast and it wasn't easy, but it was forward motion, and that made all the difference. During the work, he often paused to think. He reflected on what truly mattered. The fire had taken possessions, but it had not taken his memories, his resilience, or the people around him who cared. He realized that life's value wasn't in walls or furniture, but in relationships, moments, and the inner strength that guided him through the hardest times. There were quiet evenings when he would sit by the incomplete frame of the house, holding the keepsake in his hands. Sometimes he would close his eyes and remember the fire, the panic, the smoke, the grief. But he also remembered the moment of discovery, the relief and wonder he had felt when he had found that small object in the ashes. It reminded him that life had a way of giving back even after taking so much. Slowly, laughter returned to his life. Small joys like helping a neighbor carry supplies or sharing a meal with friends reminded him that happiness could be found even in hard times. He learned to celebrate tiny victories, A beam lifted into place, a roof finally covered, a room that no longer smelled of smoke. Each small success was a step toward reclaiming not just his home, but his sense of self. Months later, the house began to feel like a home again. It wasn't the same as before, and it never could be. But that was okay. This house was more than walls and a roof. It was a testament to survival, resilience, and hope. The keepsake found in the ashes sat on a small shelf in the new home, a quiet reminder of what had endured, what mattered most, and what could never be taken away. He often thought back to the day of the fire, remembering the panic, the loss, and the silence that followed. At the time, it had felt like the end of everything, but in truth, it had been a beginning. Losing everything had forced him to see clearly what was priceless, not possessions. Not comfort, not safety, but the memories, love, and strength he carried inside himself. The small house, rebuilt and humble, stood as a symbol of that realization. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't luxurious, but it was alive with effort, hope, and care. And each morning, as sunlight poured through the windows, he felt gratitude. Gratitude for survival, for kindness, for the small keepsake that had reminded him that life could endure even the darkest moments. He had lost everything in seconds, but he had gained something far more valuable: understanding, perspective, and hope. He had learned that life could take what it wanted, but it could never take the human spirit, memories, and love that lived within him. In the ashes, he had found a second chance, a deeper appreciation for life and the courage to continue forward, no matter what the future held. And with that courage, he stepped into each new day, carrying not the weight of what had been lost, but the quiet power of what had survived. The fire had changed him, yes, but it had not destroyed him. Instead, it had reminded him of the things that truly mattered, and in the end, those things were far more valuable than anything a fire could burn. Months had passed since the fire, but its memory still lingered, not as pain, but as a quiet reminder of how fragile life could be. The man's new home had begun to feel familiar, though it was different from what he had lost. The walls were brighter, the rooms smaller, and the floorboards creaked in new ways. Yet every corner was touched by his effort, by the hands that had worked tirelessly to rebuild what had been destroyed. It was his home, not because of what it looked like, but because it carried his story, his sweat, and his heart. Each morning, he would wake with the sunlight streaming through the window and pause for a moment, taking in the calm of the day. The keepsake he had found in the ashes rested on the small shelf beside his bed. Its presence was a gentle reminder of everything he had endured, survived, and learned. It symbolized hope, resilience, and the unbroken parts of life that fire could never touch. Sometimes he picked it up, turned it in his hands, and remembered the exact moment he had found it in the rubble. The shock, the relief, and the deep, almost overwhelming feeling of gratitude. Life had not returned to the old normal, and perhaps it never would. He had learned that normal was not a place or a house, but a state of mind. It was a willingness to keep moving forward even when everything seemed lost. It was seeing the sunrise after a storm, laughing after tears, and discovering joy in small everyday moments. That realization had changed him. He noticed small things now that he hadn't before: the way the wind brushed through the trees, the sound of children laughing outside, the taste of tea shared with a neighbor. These moments felt larger, fuller, more alive than anything he had ever taken for granted. He had started reconnecting with the community around him in a way he never had before. Neighbors who had once been familiar faces became friends, offering support, company, and companionship. They worked together on small projects, shared meals, and talked about the fire, not to dwell on the tragedy, but to recognize how it had shaped them, how it had reminded them what truly mattered. Slowly, he realized that the fire had not just taken, it had also given. It had strengthened relationships, built empathy, and reminded everyone of the value of presence and care. Sometimes, in the evenings, he would sit outside on the small porch of the rebuilt house. The air was cool and the sky gradually turned pink and orange. He thought about the past, but he no longer lingered in sorrow. Instead, he reflected on lessons learned. He thought about resilience, not the kind celebrated in stories or movies, but the quiet, unassuming kind that existed in ordinary people, in daily life, in small acts of courage. He realized that true strength was not about avoiding hardship, but facing it, surviving it, and carrying the lessons forward. The keepsake remained his constant companion, and he often shared its story with neighbors and friends. He didn't tell it as a tale of tragedy, but as a story of hope. He wanted others to understand that even when life took everything, there could still be meaning, even beauty, left in what remained. He wanted to show that even ashes could contain something priceless. And as he spoke, he felt a connection forming, a recognition that human lives, fragile and fleeting, could endure and grow stronger through loss. Work had resumed too. He took up a small job in the town, one that gave him routine and purpose. Each day was a mixture of physical labor, planning, and quiet reflection. The work wasn't easy, and there were days when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, but he had learned to embrace the fatigue, to see it as proof of effort and progress. Even as he labored, he thought about the fire, the loss, and the journey since then. He realized he was no longer defined by what he had lost, but by how he had responded, how he had survived, and how he continued to build. His evenings often included quiet walks. He wandered through streets he had known all his life, noticing small changes and hidden beauties. The laughter of children, the scent of flowers blooming in neighbors' yards, the patterns of clouds shifting in the sky, all these simple things became his companions. He found a deep satisfaction in the ordinary, a sense of peace that had eluded him before. In a strange way, the fire had taught him to see the world differently, to notice life in its smallest and most precious forms. Sometimes, when he paused by the ruins of the old house, now completely cleared, he thought about what had been. He remembered the panic, the grief, and the emptiness. And then he remembered the moment he had found the keepsake, the small treasure that had survived everything. Holding it again, even after all these months, he understood that it had not just survived the fire. It had survived him. It had reminded him of what was important, and in doing so, it had allowed him to survive too. As time went on, he began to share more of his story with others. Children, neighbors, and friends would listen as he described the morning the fire started, the chaos, the fear, and the moment of discovery. He didn't tell it for sympathy, nor did he embellish the drama. He told it plainly, simply, truthfully, with a focus on what it had taught him. And as he spoke, he realized that his experience, painful as it had been, could inspire others. It could remind them to value life, to cherish relationships, and to find hope in even the darkest times. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, he stood on the small porch, the keepsake resting safely in his hands. The air was quiet, the street calm. He thought about everything he had endured, and a sense of deep, quiet gratitude filled him. He was alive. He had survived. He had lost everything. Yet he had found more than he could have imagined: strength, perspective, and a renewed appreciation for life. He realized then that the fire had not destroyed him. It had revealed him. It had stripped away the superficial and left only what was real and important. And in that truth he found freedom. Freedom to rebuild. Freedom to love. Freedom to live fully, even after loss. And so, life continued. Days were still filled with challenges, moments of doubt and occasional sadness, but there were also moments of laughter, triumph, and simple beauty. He carried the lessons of the fire, the memory of the keepsake, and the gratitude for survival with him wherever he went. It had been a journey from loss to discovery, from despair to hope, from ashes to life. He had lost everything in seconds, but he had found something priceless in the ashes. And now, months later, he understood that the true value of life was not measured by what could be destroyed, but by what endured, by what survived, and by what could never be taken away: the heart, the memories, the hope, and the human spirit itself. With a final glance at the horizon, he smiled softly, knowing that the future, whatever it held, would be met with courage, love, and gratitude. The fire had ended one chapter, but life, resilient and unbroken, had written the next one, and he was ready to live it fully.